mean I'll see it.
You know how people talk about the Appalachian Trail like it's this spiritual, life-changing journey? They show you the photos of the sunsets over the Blue Ridge Mountains and the mist rolling through the valleys, but they never tell you about the silence. It isn't a peaceful silence. It's heavy, like the woods are holding their breath, waiting for you to trip or lose your way. My wife, Sarah, and I thought we were ready for it. We had our gear, we had the maps, and we had our 4-year-old, Leo. We just wanted a week away from the noise of the city. We wanted to give Leo his first real taste of the wild. But looking back, I think the wild was the one looking for a taste of us. It started on the 3rd day. We were deep in a section they call the Green Tunnel, where the canopy is so thick the sun barely hits the forest floor. It was humid, that sticky kind of heat that makes your clothes feel like a second, heavier skin. Leo was doing great, following the white blazes on the trees, carrying his little plastic canteen. Around mid-afternoon, we stopped by a shallow creek to refill our water filters. Sarah was crouching by the bank, and I was sitting on a mossy log, rubbing my heels. That's when I heard it. It was Sarah's voice. It came from about 30 yards behind us, up the trail we had just walked. She sounded urgent, but not panicked. Just a sharp, clear call. Hey, come look at this. I think I found a turtle. I looked down at the creek. Sarah was right there. She hadn't moved. She was still pumping the water filter, her back to me. She froze, the rhythmic clicking of the pump stopping instantly. She turned her head slowly, her face pale, looking at the dense thicket where the voice had come from. It wasn't just a voice that sounded like hers. It was her. The exact pitch, the specific way she drags the S on the end of words, it was a perfect carbon copy. I didn't say that, she whispered. Her eyes were wide, darting between me and the bushes. Before I could even process what was happening, another voice rang out. This time it was mine. It came from the opposite direction, deeper in the trees. It sounded like I was laughing, a low, guttural chuckle I usually make when I'm playing with Leo. Gotcha, the voice said. Leo, I gotcha. The real Leo was standing right next to the log, staring into the dark line of hemlocks. He wasn't scared. He was smiling. He started to take a step toward the woods, his little hand reaching out as if someone was waiting for him in the shadows. I lunged for him, grabbing his harness and pulling him back so hard he stumbled. We didn't talk. We didn't debate. We just grabbed our packs and moved. We hiked until the sun was a bruised purple behind the ridge, pushing Leo faster than a 4-year-old should ever have to go. We made camp in a clearing that felt exposed, but at least we could see what was coming. That night, the voices didn't stop. They circled the tent. We lay there, clutching a hunting knife and a canister of bear spray, listening to ourselves talk to each other in the dark. It was the most visceral, gut-wrenching thing I've ever experienced, hearing my own voice whisper to Sarah through the nylon of the tent, telling her to come outside and see the stars. The voice was wrong, though. It was too rhythmic, like a recording being played on a loop, or something trying to learn how to breathe while it spoke. In the morning, the woods were dead silent. No birds, no insects. Just the sound of our own panicked breathing. Leo was different when he woke up. He didn't ask for breakfast. He just sat on his sleeping bag, staring at the tent wall. When I went to zip up his jacket, he looked at me, and for a split second, his eyes didn't look like a child's. They looked like 2 holes burned into a sheet of paper. We cut the trip short and practically ran the last 6 miles to the trailhead where our car was parked. The whole drive home, Leo didn't say a single word. He just watched the trees passing by the window with a focus that was unnatural. We've been home for a week now, and the true crime of it all is that I can't tell anyone. Who would believe me? They'd call Child Protective Services. They'd say we had a collective breakdown from exhaustion. But things are happening in this house that I can't explain away. It started with the family dog, Buster. Buster has slept at the foot of Leo's bed since the day we brought the boy home from the hospital. 2 nights ago, I heard a sound coming from Leo's room, a wet, tearing noise, followed by a soft, rhythmic thudding. I cracked the door open, thinking Leo was sick. The room smelled like copper and old, stagnant pond water. Leo was sitting on the floor in the middle of a patch of moonlight. He had his back to me. Buster was lying in front of him, motionless. My son, or the thing that looks like my son, was leaning over the dog. I saw his small, pale shoulders heave. He was eating. Not like a child. Eats, but like an animal, tearing at the soft tissue of the dog's underbelly with his bare teeth. I should have screamed. I should have grabbed him. But I was frozen. Then Leo's head snapped back 180 degrees. His body didn't move, just his neck, twisting with a sickening series of pops and cracks that sounded like dry kindling snapping in a fire. He looked at me, his face smeared with dark, glistening gore. His jaw, it was unhinged. It hung too low, the skin of his cheeks stretched so thin I could see the bone beneath. "Dad," he said. But it wasn't his voice. It was the voice of the man who lives next door. "Dad, I'm still hungry." I backed out of the room and locked the door from the outside. I told Sarah that Leo had a night terror and I didn't want him wandering around. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the hallway with the shotgun, listening. I heard things moving inside that room. Not footsteps. It sounded like something heavy and wet being dragged across the carpet. I heard the sound of furniture being pushed around, and then the most horrible sound of all. I heard my own voice coming from inside my son's bedroom. It was me, crying. It was the exact sound of my own sobbing, perfectly replicated over and over again. Yesterday, I tried to look at him during lunch. He was sitting at the table, picking at a plate of raw hamburger meat I'd given him because I was too afraid to see what he'd do if I didn't. His skin looks loose. That's the only way I can describe it. It's like he's wearing a suit that's a size too big. There are moments when I see something moving beneath the surface of his neck, a ripple, like a parasite or a muscle shifting where there shouldn't be one. His fingernails are turning black and jagged, and he started to lose his hair in thick, matted clumps, revealing a gray, pebbled scalp underneath. Sarah is starting to notice. She asked me why Leo smells like rotting leaves. She asked me why he doesn't blink anymore. I can see the terror in her eyes, the same terror that's rotting me from the inside out. We're trapped in a house with something that isn't our son, but it has his face. It has his memories. This morning, I found him standing in the hallway, staring at a framed photo of our wedding. He was running a long, multi-jointed finger over Sarah's face in the picture. "She looks delicious," he whispered. This time, he used Sarah's mother's voice. I don't know how much longer the skin will hold. I can see the seams starting to fray around his wrists and behind his ears. There's something underneath that skin, something ancient and hungry that followed us back from those woods. It's mimicking us, learning us, waiting for the moment when it doesn't need the disguise anymore. I'm sitting in the living room now, typing this while Sarah is in the shower. I can hear the water running. And I can hear Leo outside the bathroom door. He's talking to her. He's using my voice, telling her he loves her, telling her he's coming in to join her. I have the gun in my lap, but my hands are like lead. Because if I kill it, if I shoot the thing that looks like my 4-year-old boy, how do I ever explain that to the police? How do I tell them that my son died on a trail in the mountains, and this thing just took his place? The water just stopped running. I hear the bathroom door creak open. And then I hear Sarah scream, not a scream of fear, but a wet, choked off sound that ends in a sickening gurgle. I'm going down the hall now. I don't think I'm coming back. If you ever go hiking and you hear your own voice calling from the trees, don't look back. Just run. Because once it hears you, it never stops wanting to be you.
Next story.
You know how everyone tells you that moving out to the middle of nowhere is the ultimate dream for a family? They talk about the fresh air, the space for the kids to run, and that silence you can only find when you're miles away from the nearest neighbor. We believed it. We bought this old ranch house sitting on a few hundred acres, mostly scrubland and pine trees, thinking it was the start of a new life. But there's a specific kind of silence out there that isn't peaceful. It's heavy. It feels like the land is holding its breath, waiting for you to make a mistake. It started with the cattle. We only had about 20 head of Hereford, just enough to keep the grass down and give us something to focus on, but they were usually the calmest animals you'd ever meet. Then, about 3 weeks ago, they stopped acting like themselves. They wouldn't graze together anymore. They'd huddle in the corner of the paddock, facing outward, their eyes wide and rolling in their heads. At night, the sound was unbearable. It wasn't just mooing, it was this low, rhythmic lowing that sounded almost like a funeral dirge. They were terrified of the dark, and pretty soon, we were too. The night it all went south, the air felt thick, like a storm was coming, but the sky was perfectly clear. I remember sitting in the living room with my wife, Sarah, trying to focus on a book while our 2 kids were asleep upstairs. Every tiny creak of the floorboards felt like a gunshot. Around midnight, the cattle started screaming. There's no other word for it. It was a high-pitched, vibrating sound of pure agony. I grabbed my flashlight and the old shotgun I keep by the door, thinking maybe a pack of coyotes had gotten into the pens. When I stepped onto the porch, the smell hit me first. It wasn't the usual smell of manure and dust. It was the smell of a butcher shop that had lost power in the middle of July. It was copper and rot, so thick I could almost taste it on the back of my tongue. I shined the light toward the paddock, but the cattle weren't being attacked. They were just standing there, staring at the house. Every single one of them had their heads turned toward the porch where I was standing. I felt this prickle on the back of my neck, that primal instinct that tells you something is watching you from a place you can't see. I slowly turned the flashlight toward the edge of the porch, where the shadows were deepest. At first, I thought it was just a man. He was tall, maybe 7 feet, but he was hunched over so far his knuckles were almost brushing the wood. He didn't have any clothes on, but his skin didn't look like skin. It looked like old, gray parchment that had been stretched too tight over a frame of mismatched bones. He was just standing there, swaying slightly. I tried to say something, to tell him to get off my property, but the words died in my throat. When he turned his head toward me, the light caught his eyes. They weren't human eyes. They were large, pale, and completely devoid of pupils, just 2 milky orbs reflecting the flashlight like a cat's. But the worst part was the mouth. It was stitched shut with what looked like rusted wire, but the wire was moving, twitching as if the muscles underneath were trying to scream. Sarah came to the door behind me, and I felt her hand drop onto my shoulder. She didn't scream, but I felt her fingers dig into my skin so hard it left bruises. We watched this thing, this skinwalker, I guess you'd call it, as it started to move. It didn't walk like a person. Its joints bent the wrong way, popping and clicking with every step. It sounded like someone breaking dry cedar planks. It moved toward the stairs of the porch, and that's when it started to change. I've seen things in movies, special effects, and all that, but nothing prepares you for the visceral, wet reality of a body rewriting itself. It dropped to all fours, and its spine began to ripple and arch. You could see the vertebrae pushing against that gray skin, snapping and resetting in a frantic, sickening rhythm. Its limbs shortened, the bone grinding against bone with a sound that I still hear every time I close my eyes. The gray skin began to fold over itself, darkening and sprouting patches of coarse, matted black fur that looked like it had been glued on with dried blood. The sound of it was the worst part. It wasn't a clean transformation. It was a struggle. It was the sound of meat being shredded and reconstructed. There was a wet, tearing noise, like someone pulling apart a raw chicken as its face elongated into a snout. The wire in its mouth didn't fall out, it was absorbed, disappearing into the growing mass of muscle and fur. In less than a minute, the 7-foot nightmare was gone, and in its place sat a dog. It looked like a black Labrador, the kind you'd see in any suburban backyard, but it was wrong. Its legs were a little too long, and its head was tilted at an angle that would have broken a normal dog's neck. It sat there on the porch, staring at us through the screen door. It didn't growl. It didn't bark. It just breathed, a heavy, raspy sound that smelled like a grave. I backed up, pulling Sarah with me, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it would break. We retreated into the kitchen, the only room with a solid door we could lock, but I forgot about the one thing that had been a convenience for us since we moved in. Our old dog, Buster, had passed away a few months prior, but we had never blocked off the doggy door in the back mudroom. We heard it then. The heavy, rhythmic thud of paws on the porch, moving toward the back of the house. We stood in the kitchen, clutching each other, listening as the creature reached the mudroom. There was a soft clack-clack of the plastic flap on the doggy door. I looked down at the gap under the kitchen door. First, I saw the snout. It was wet and black, sniffing at the air with a frantic, desperate hunger. Then, the rest of it started to squeeze through. The doggy door was only 10 inches wide, but this thing didn't care about the size of its own frame. We heard the ribs snap. One by one, crack, 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 as it forced its torso through the small opening. It was a wet, sliding sound, like a heavy weight being dragged through mud. It was in the house now. We could hear it dragging its broken, mangled body across the linoleum of the mudroom, the sound of its fractured ribs scraping against the floor. It was whimpering now, but the whimper sounded like Sarah's voice. It was calling her name over and over in a flat, distorted monotone that made my skin crawl. Sarah. 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 I gripped the shotgun, my knuckles white, but my hands were shaking so badly I knew I'd miss if I pulled the trigger. The scratching at the kitchen door started, long, slow draws of claws against wood. It wasn't trying to break the door down, it was testing it, looking for a way in. We stayed in that kitchen until the sun came up, listening to that thing pace the hallway, mimicking our voices, mimicking the cries of our children upstairs. It knew we were inside. It knew we were listening. When the first light of dawn finally hit the windows, the noise stopped. I eventually found the courage to open the door. The mudroom was covered in a thick, translucent slime mixed with tufts of black fur and small shards of white bone. The doggy door was shredded, the plastic frame hanging by a single screw. But the creature was gone. We left that day. We didn't even pack everything. We just grabbed the kids and the dog's old collar and drove until we hit the interstate. I sold the ranch for a fraction of what it was worth to some developer who probably won't ever visit the property. Sometimes I look at the news, waiting to see if anything happens out there, but there's never a word. The thing is, I live in a regular suburb now, in a house with no doggy door and high fences. But last night, I heard a sound on the porch. It wasn't a footstep. It was a wet, heavy pop, like a joint being forced out of its socket. And then, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard a voice outside the bedroom window. It sounded just like me, whispering my own name, asking to be let in because it was cold. Whatever that thing was, it didn't want the cattle. It didn't even want the house. It wanted to see how we sounded when we were afraid, so it could learn to speak like us. And I think it's almost finished practicing.
Next story.
I never used to believe the stories about the woods. You know, the ones, the warnings about not staying after dark, or how the silence in certain valleys isn't actually silence, but the forest holding its breath. I grew up hiking those trails alone, thinking I was the master of my own surroundings. I thought I knew every sound, every movement of the brush. But looking back, I realized that nature doesn't have a heart. It has a stomach. And I invited something inside that was never meant to leave the shadows. I was deep in the high country, miles from the nearest trailhead, when I found him. The air was getting that sharp, pre-winter bite to it, and the ground was thick with damp, rotting needles. I heard a whimpering first, a thin, pathetic sound that cut right through the wind. Hidden under a cluster of rusted ferns was a fox kid. He couldn't have been more than a few weeks old. He was a ball of wet, matted copper fur, shivering so hard I could see his tiny ribs vibrating. His mother was nowhere to be found, and in that part of the mountains, a kid that small is just a snack for a coyote or an owl. I should have left him. That's the thought that keeps me up at night, the simple, brutal reality that if I had just kept walking, I would still be me. But I didn't. I picked him up, tucked him into the fleece of my jacket, and felt his tiny heart hammering against my chest. He felt so heavy for his size, almost like he was made of something denser than bone and muscle. I named him Jasper. The first few weeks were actually okay. He was affectionate in a weird way. He didn't act like the wild foxes you see on nature documentaries. He was too still. He would sit on the edge of my bed and just watch me sleep. I'd wake up at 3 in the morning and find him sitting perfectly upright, his yellow eyes reflecting the moonlight, staring at my throat. I told myself it was just a rescue animal's instinct, that he was making sure his pack leader was still there. But then he started growing. And he didn't stop. By the second month, Jasper was the size of a full-grown red fox, but his proportions were off. His legs were a bit too long, his joints knobby and thick. When he ran, he didn't have that fluid, low-to-the-ground glide. It was more of a frantic, jerky scramble, like he was still learning how to use his own limbs. I started noticing things around the house, too. The neighbor's cat went missing, and then a few days later, I found a pile of gray fur in a clean snapped collar under my porch. There was no blood. It was like the cat had been sucked dry of every fluid before its bones were crushed into powder. I tried to tell myself it was just nature. Jasper was a predator, after all. But his behavior at home was getting harder to ignore. He stopped eating the high-end raw dog food I bought for him. I'd find him in the kitchen, standing on his hind legs, perfectly balanced, staring at the handle of the back door. He wasn't sniffing it. He was studying it. When he saw me, he dropped back down to all fours, but the movement was wrong. It was too slow, too deliberate, like a person pretending to be an animal. The smell started around the 3rd month. It wasn't the typical musky scent of a fox. It was a cloying, sweet rot, like meat left out in a hot car. It seemed to come from his skin, or whatever was underneath it. He started shedding, but not in clumps. Great strips of his fur would just peel away, revealing skin that was raw, wet, and a pale, bruised purple. He looked like he was turning inside out. I took him to a vet out in the valley, but the moment we pulled into the parking lot, Jasper went ballistic. It wasn't a bark or a growl. It was a wet, rattling sound that seemed to come from his chest instead of his throat. He threw himself against the car window with such force that the glass spiderwebbed. His eyes, they weren't yellow anymore. They were turning a muddy, human brown. I was too terrified to go inside. I just drove home in silence, while he sat in the passenger seat, panting with a tongue that was far too long and lined with tiny, needle-like bumps. That night was the first time I heard the voice. I was drifting off to sleep when I heard a whisper from the corner of the room. It sounded like me. It was my tone, my inflection, but the words were garbled, like someone trying to speak with a mouthful of marbles. It was just one word, repeated over and over, hungry, hungry, hungry. I sat up and flicked on the lamp. Jasper was sitting at the foot of my bed. But he wasn't a fox anymore. He was something caught in the middle of a horrific transition. He was nearly 4 feet tall now, leaning against the wall. His front legs had lengthened into arms, the paws stretching out into long, multi-jointed fingers tipped with black, hooked claws. His face was the worst part. The snout had receded, pushing the nose and mouth into a flat, fleshy mask that looked like a melted version of my own face. He didn't run. He just looked at me with those brown, human eyes and tilted his head. The sound of his neck bones snapping into place filled the room, a series of wet, heavy cracks that made my stomach turn. I realized then that he wasn't growing. He was consuming. He was taking my shape, my essence, and discarding the rest. I tried to kick him out, but he wouldn't go. He just followed me from room to room, always a few paces behind, mimicking my gait. If I scratched my head, he would lift a gnarled, furless hand and scratch his. If I sighed, he would let out a wheezing imitation of a breath. The house began to smell like a slaughterhouse. I found the remains of a deer in the bathtub one morning, just the head and the spine, licked clean of every scrap of tissue. The physical changes accelerated. One evening, I caught him in the bathroom. He was standing in front of the mirror, using his claws to peel back the remaining patches of red fur from his chest. Underneath, the skin was a perfect, pale match for mine. He was even growing hair in the same places I had it. He looked at me through the reflection, and for a split second, I couldn't tell which one of us was real. He smiled, and his mouth was filled with 3 rows of jagged, translucent teeth. The violence started yesterday. I woke up to a searing pain in my calf. Jasper, or the thing that used to be Jasper, was hunched over the end of the bed. He had taken a literal chunk out of my leg. He wasn't even eating it. He was holding the piece of my flesh against his own leg, watching as the raw tissue began to fuse with his purple skin. He was grafting me onto himself. I screamed and kicked him away, but he didn't even flinch. He just stood up, his spine elongating with a sound like a tree branch breaking in a storm. He's nearly 6 feet tall now. He wears my old flannel shirt, though it's tight across his distorted, muscular shoulders. He doesn't make fox noises anymore. He just watches me and waits. I'm locked in the basement now. I have my phone and a heavy iron wrench, but I know it's not enough. I can hear him upstairs. He's walking around, but he's not scrambling anymore. His footsteps are heavy, rhythmic, exactly like mine. I can hear him opening the fridge, sliding the chairs across the floor, even humming a tune I haven't thought of since I was a kid. The worst part isn't the fear of dying. It's the sound from the other side of the basement door. He's been standing there for 3 hours. Perfectly still. Every few minutes, he leans close to the wood and whispers in my own voice. He's telling me about the woods. He's telling me how cold it was under those ferns and how much he appreciated me bringing him home into the warmth. He just said my mother's name. He said it with the exact same lilt I use when I'm happy to see her. I can hear the hinges creaking now. He's not forcing the door. He's using the key I keep hidden under the vase in the hallway. He knows where everything is. He knows everything I know. I'm looking at the small window at the top of the foundation, but I'm too weak from the blood loss to climb out. If you ever find a lost thing in the woods, something small and helpless that looks like it needs a home, just keep walking. Don't look back. Don't let your heart trick you into thinking that everything deserves to be saved. Because some things aren't looking for a home. They're looking for a skin. And once they have yours, there's nowhere left for you to go. The door is opening. I can see his hand on the frame. The fingers are long, and the skin is still wet, but the fingernails, they look just like mine.
Next story. Next story is yours. Take a look at the shadow in the corner of your room. Are you sure it was that shape a minute ago? Subscribe or be the next in line.